Greetings, this is the Garage Autonomist. One of my favorites on YouTube has given me the permission to mirror her video on the racism of the suffragist movement. One of the talking points I hear from the black patriarchs when they confront feminists of color is how racist the suffragists were and how Margaret Sanger believed in the annihilation of black people, etc. The nature of these arguments are just empirical and weak. Cheap-ass attempts to convince someone to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's to shame women of color for embracing self-determinationism and resisting patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny. Many feminists of color have been walking their own path since the first wave because they have been in conflict with the race and class contradictions of white feminists. But their challenge has always been to stay the course and to continue to fight the dual and triple oppressions women of color face. Natalie Alford made a fucking awesome video talking about the racism of the first wave and their use of white supremacy to gain support of white Southern women and really any woman who wanted to hang on to their white supremacy because they wanted to. And now, here she is, Natalie Alford.
All right, guys, it's time for real Black History Month. Woo! Where we talk about the history that should be taught throughout the year, but it isn't, and it's also not taught within Black History Month. And I want to talk about the suffragists. Oh yeah, I'm going there. I'm going to attack the origins of white feminism. Oh yeah, I'm getting to that shit. So, one of the things we're taught about the suffragists is that Susan B. Anthony and Katie Stanton and all the work that they did for the suffragist movement. Hold on, I'm going to do that. And it started around 1848 and, they were getting hot and heavy around the 1870s, if you know what I'm saying. But we aren't really taught about Frederick Douglass or Ida B. Wells and their being suffragists. And the reasons for that are very interesting because one of the things that the suffragist movement did was that they sided with Southern white feminists, and it was actually a pretty prominent decision. So basically one day, and you can read this in your Women, Race, and Class, chapter 7, page 110 through 112 for anybody who needs citation, Susan B. Anthony asked Frederick Douglass, who had spoken at suffragist movements before, to not come to a NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She asked him not to come to a convention in Atlanta, Georgia to speak. And her reasoning was that she didn't want to offend the white women there. So she told Ida B. Wells this, and Ida B. Wells was like, what the fuck? And Susan B. Anthony was like, well, what? What did you expect me to do? And Ida B. Wells said, you basically are reinforcing Southern white women's attitudes on segregation. And not only that, Northern women on their attitude of segregation. Because sundown towns, yeah, they were a thing. Look them up. I'm going to probably do another Black History Month on that. And you also have to keep in mind, during this period while they were doing that, lynchings were going on. That was Ida B. Wells' whole fucking thing. Ida B. Wells is amazing. Her journalism was extraordinary. Her meticulous work on finding out and investigating the cases of lynching was extraordinary. That's the only reason we have record of what happened at that time. And Susan B. Anthony and her were friends, and I can get into the whole, your white liberal friend who's like, I can talk about shit with you, but in front of other white people and the organization I'm working for, I can't really bring it up. And we still have those problems today. So, let's go into Henry Blackwell and Lucy Stone, two very prominent suffragists. They assisted Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in an 1867 campaign in Kansas. So, they were good buds. And also, they were both supporters of the 14th and 15th Amendment. They were so liberal. Let's see how liberal they were. Let's see how down for the cause they were. At an NAWSA meeting in 1895, he stated that attaching a literacy test to the vote could solve the Negro problem. I continue. Consider the result from the Southern standpoint. You gotta think of the Southerners. Your 4 million of Southern white women will counterbalance your 4 million of Negro men and women, and thus political supremacy of your white race will remain unchanged. So vote. Power to women. Ah! Am I being divisive, white feminists? Am I being divisive right now for pointing out that happened? I'm sorry. He was a, big suffragist, a great speaker for Southern white feminists. And you also have to realize about this. This wasn't only about, it was about racism, but it was about racism with economic power. Because this was a big thing. Once slavery, so you had all these people who were like anti-slavery, but then once black people finally had their humanity, once black state legislators were being elected in, you had a middle-class black community, you actually had wealthy black communities, and that caused a lot of lynchings because white people were just like, you gotta get the fuck out of town because we don't like you. And especially with the way that the unions worked, and then they did union busting because you had corporations being like, well then I'll hire black people to take your place. So you had a lot of this fucking, they're taking our land, they're taking our power. But they weren't taking their power. They were gaining their own power. But this drove them crazy. That's why lynchings were on the rise when slavery ended. Because at least with slavery, it's like, oh, I can't kill you because it'll be a waste of money. But then once that financial incentive was removed, like, that's a sick reaction when you really think about it, okay? And the fact that there were fucking suffragists at these conventions, at the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Why do you think the White Citizens Council had a shit ton of women? Why do you think that the KKK had, like, women KKK? It was very, they were like, we need a women's KKK too. We gotta vote. White power. Another example, in 1892 convention of the NAWSA, Susan B. Anthony was president at the time. They were able to pass this resolution. Well, you know, there were at least 200 recorded lynchings a year. And Jim Crow laws were being passed, and black people were being restricted from voting and being killed over it, and white mobs were killing people. This is what the suffragists were able to pass. Resolved that without expressing any opinion on the proper qualifications for voting. Just saying, nothing, just saying, that's what that sentence means. We call attention to the significant facts that in every state there are more women who can read and write than the whole number of illiterate male voters. More white women who can read and write than all the Negro voters. More American women who can read and write than all the foreign voters. So that the enfranchisement of such women would settle the vexed question of rule by illiteracy, whether homegrown or foreign-born production. Don't get schools for those people. Nah. Don't consider that you have, like, education because you're fucking privileged and you're fucking rich. Nah. Who needs that? You gotta vote because you're better, white women. That's a you're better, white women. Don't think sundown towns are going on in the North. Don't think that. by accepting this attitude, making these resolutions, it is acknowledgement of we are okay with this system because we don't care. What was Martin Luther King talking about? Some of the most dangerous people in a movement are the people who are silent. The people who are silent let this shit happen. And not only that, this is advocacy of you're better, you know better. You know better than all those people, white women. You are just so amazing. Fuck. Now, another example of just straight up ignoring a black woman speaking, like some white feminists like to do. Sorry, I've got to move this thing. In 1899, in Michigan NAWSA convention, black people were allowed in the conventions in Michigan. So, a black women's appeal for a resolution from them against Jim Crow laws that a train company had of segregationist policies, it was ignored. Lottie Wilson Jackson, she was a black suffragist, and she was saying, black people always get put into the smoking cars, and those are like awful, and can we protest the railroad? And this is what Susan B. Anthony said. We women are helpless, disenfranchised class. Our hands are tied. Oh, doesn't that sound like the most white feminist response? Like, oh my God, we can't do anything. We're like fighting our thing, but we'll think of you. Continuing. While we are in this condition, it's not for us to go passing resolutions against railroad corporations or anybody else. Sorry, girls. But, Haru, like, the manner of just putting something down to appease a system because you want white fucking money from the South. Because that's what this is about. That's what this is about. And ignoring the murders and the rapes that were going on. This is what we talk about, or people of color who are feminists talk about when we say white feminism, because it has foundations, man. And I really bring up the questions. If the foundations in a house are fucked up, how in the world is something going to function properly when you're still dealing with that shit today? And let's get to the Donald Trump of suffragists, shall we? Belle Kearney from Mississippi in 1903 at an NAWSA convention. Only fitting the Negro for power, and when the black man becomes necessary to a community by reason of his skill and acquired wealth, something of a race war will result. Black people, when you get educated, you're just going to want to kill white people. Because that's what I believe, because there's all this fucking propaganda, even though, at the time, white mobs are fucking murdering black people. White mobs are kicking black communities out of towns. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Florida. Look it up. But this is the ideology that suffragists were doing and employing people to speak and promote. See, the suffragette movement had the problem and they ignored it. And that's what we're talking about. When you hear people like Meryl Streep saying we're all Africans, and then, we really could have used that logic during all this shit. We really could have. But you don't know this history. Why? Because it isn't taught within Black History Month. And we don't know enough about I.W. Wells, which, by the way, I'm doing a whole other Black History Month on her. It might be 2 parts. There's so much shit to cover with her. But the lesson is, as feminists, as intersectional feminists, we need to learn this stuff. And we need to demand that this is taught so that we aren't holding or teaching people ignorance. You can't be ignorant of your heroes. You can't. You can't ignore their flaws. You can't ignore their faults. You can recognize the good things that they did, but you can also understand that they promoted racist ideology to appease to Southern white women. And that contributed to a lot of female membership of White Citizens Council because they learned their political power, man. A lot of Southern white politicians, male, really like the idea too. So, with that being said, this is Real Black History Month. I got a Twitter, I got an Instagram, I got a Facebook. And guys, thank you so much for subscribing. You guys have an awesome, fucking lovely day. Stay positive, stay educated. And that's it. Ah!